Previously in Starlight Exodus.
Everyone, fall back! We need to regroup!
Jimmy Pratt and Eric Hendricks exchanged a grim look as the monstrous crabs continued to tear through the small station outpost. The walls, once sturdy and reliable, crumbled under the relentless assault, and the floor shook with each impact of the crabs' massive pincers. The research crew, huddled in the corner, could only watch in terror as their sanctuary was dismantled piece by piece.
Right! Let's not waste any more time. Get that laser cutter ready.
His voice trembled slightly, but his resolve was unshaken.
On it!
Eric grabbed the laser cutter, a device meant for delicate work, not for battling colossal alien crabs. He powered it on, the bright beam cutting through the air with a sharp hum.
Aim for their eyes. It's our only shot.
The crew scrambled to gather what little they had that could be used as weapons. The first crab lunged toward them, its pincers snapping menacingly. Eric fired the laser cutter at its eyes, the beam slicing through the air with a high-pitched whine. The crab screeched in pain as the laser connected with one of its eyes, a thick, dark liquid oozing from the wound. The creature reared back, thrashing violently as it attempted to shield its injured eye.
It's working! Keep aiming for the eyes!
Encouraged by the success, the crew members armed themselves with whatever they could find, tools, debris, anything that could be used to distract the creatures, while Eric and Jimmy focused on taking out the eyes. Another crab advanced, its enormous pincers smashing through the last of their barricades. Jimmy quickly fired the laser, and once again, the beam found its mark, sending the crab into a fit of rage and pain.
We can't hold out like this forever. We need to slow them down more.
The ground beneath them trembled as more crabs converged on the outpost, their numbers seeming to swell by the minute. The crew was running out of space and options, their backs quite literally against the wall.
We need to lure them away from the entrance. Give the rescue team a chance to get in.
Agreed. Everyone, prepare to move out. We need to draw them to the other side of the outpost.
As the crabs closed in, Jimmy and Eric led the crew in a desperate dash toward the far end of the outpost. The crabs, now half blinded and enraged, pursued them, their massive legs tearing through the structure. The outpost groaned under the strain, parts of it collapsing as the crabs advanced.
Eric, set the laser cutter to overdrive. We'll take out as many of them as we can in one final stand.
Eric adjusted the settings on the laser cutter, cranking it to maximum output. The device whined ominously as it began to overheat, but they had no other choice. As the crabs cornered them once more, Jimmy and Eric fired the laser at the creature's eyes with all the power they could muster. The beams cut through the air with a ferocity that matched the crabs' rage. Several crabs faltered, their movements becoming sluggish as they succumbed to their injuries. But the onslaught was relentless, and the crew knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Just as hope seemed to be fading, the sound of engines roared from above. Through the haze of destruction, the crew saw the rescue ships descending, their powerful spotlights cutting through the dust and debris.
They're here! Hold on just a little longer.
The rescue ships unleashed a barrage of heavy fire, targeting the crabs with precision strikes. The tide of the battle quickly turned as the crabs, unable to withstand the concentrated assault, began to retreat, their wounded and dead left behind. The surviving crabs fled back into the Martian landscape, their massive forms disappearing into the red dust. The rescue team landed, and Martian soldiers poured out, securing the area and rushing to the crew's aid.
We made it! We actually made it!
Exhausted and battered, the crew collapsed to the ground, as the rescue team began tending to their wounds. The outpost was in ruins, but they had survived against all odds.
That was too close, but we did it.
Jimmy nodded, staring at the smoldering remains of the outpost.
Yeah, but something tells me this is just the beginning. Those crabs, they're not going to stop.
As the rescue ships prepared to evacuate the crew, Jimmy and Eric shared a final look. They had survived the nightmare, but they knew the fight was far from over. At Jean and Simon's temporary shelter, the atmosphere was tense. The news of thousands of monster crabs being spotted, just 4 kilometers away, had sent a wave of fear through the shelter. Jean and Simon watched as the Martian military rapidly set up barricades around the perimeter. The soldiers moved with a sense of urgency, knowing that time was running out. They reinforced the outer walls with steel plates and set up automated turrets, their laser cannons humming as they came online.
Do you think those barricades will hold?
His voice was a mix of fear and hope as he watched the soldiers work.
They have to. The crabs are getting closer, and we can't outrun them this time.
The Martian military, seasoned and experienced, was well aware of the crabs' destructive capabilities. The barricades they were erecting were designed to withstand significant force, but everyone knew that the real test would come when the crabs arrived. The crabs' iron, hard shells had already proven resistant to conventional weapons, and the soldiers knew that this battle would require more than just brute force. Captain George, a tall, stern-faced officer, took charge of the defense. His voice was calm, but the urgency in his movements betrayed the gravity of the situation. He barked orders to his troops, directing them to set up laser grids and deploy mines at strategic locations around the shelter.
I want all turrets set to maximum power. Focus fire on any crabs that get within range. We have to keep them at bay until reinforcements arrive.
Jean and Simon were approached by one of the soldiers. Sergeant Vega, a tough-looking young man with a kind demeanor. He handed them each a small device, an advanced shield generator.
This will give you some protection in an emergency situation. If the crabs breach the barricades, stick close to the shelter and stay out of sight.
Jean and Simon nodded, clutching the device tightly.
Thank you. We'll be ready.
The ground began to tremble as the crabs drew nearer, their massive forms visible on the horizon. The Martian dust kicked up around them, creating an ominous cloud that seemed to advance in unison with the approaching threat.
Positions, everyone. The crabs are almost here.
Jean and Simon watched in horror as the crabs reached near the barricades. The soldiers fought valiantly, their lasers cutting through the air in a desperate attempt to fend off the creatures. But the crabs were relentless, their pincers tearing through the barricades with terrifying ease. The shelter shook as one of the crabs smashed into it, its massive pincers slamming against the reinforced walls of the shelter. The soldiers redirected their fire, concentrating on the attacking crab. Under the sustained barrage, the creature finally fell, its body collapsing in a heap of smoking exoskeleton. But the victory was short-lived. More crabs were breaking through the barricades, their numbers overwhelming the defenders. The automated turrets, now overworked and overheating, began to malfunction, their fire becoming sporadic and less effective.
We're being overrun. Fall back to the shelter.
The soldiers began a controlled retreat, firing as they moved back toward the shelter. Jean and Simon, now inside the shelter, could hear the crabs' relentless assault on the outer walls. The sound of metal being torn apart filled the air, and the ground shook with every impact.
We have to do something. We can't just sit here and wait for them to break in.
But what can we do? We're outnumbered, and those things are unstoppable.
Just then, a loud explosion rocked the shelter. The crabs had breached the outer defenses, and the walls of the shelter began to buckle under the pressure. Captain George, still coordinating the defense, activated his communicator.
This is Captain George. We need immediate extraction. The shelter is compromised.
As he spoke, the sound of engines could be heard in the communication device. Reinforcements were on their way, but it was clear that they would not arrive in time to save the shelter.
We need to buy them more time. Everyone, prepare for close quarters combat.
The remaining soldiers readied their weapons for a last stand, determined to protect the civilians at all costs. Jean and Simon, their fear giving way to a fierce determination, generates their advanced shield. The monster crabs smashed through the final barrier, their pincers snapping as they advanced into the shelter. The soldiers opened fire, the confined space amplifying the noise of the battle.
Don't let them get through! Hold the line!
The monster crabs were now inside the shelter wreaking havoc. Inhabitants run for their lives as the monster crabs strike their pincers violently. Jean and Simon turned on their shield generators. They held and hid in a corner, deflecting the worst of the attacks, but the situation was dire. Suddenly, the roar of engines filled the air, and the ceiling of the shelter was blown open by an incoming dropship. Ropes descended, and heavily armed soldiers rappelled into the fray, their weapons blazing.
Extraction team, cover the civilians! We need to get them out now!
The new arrivals poured fire into the crab, driving him back momentarily. The civilians were quickly secured and lifted out of the shelter, Jean and Simon among them. As they were pulled to safety, they could see the shelter below, now a war zone, with crabs and soldiers locked in a brutal struggle. As the dropship ascended, the ground below was lit up by a series of explosions. The Martian military blasted the shelter, killing hundreds of monster crabs. Jean and Simon, now safe but shaken, looked out of the dropship's window at the burning remains of the shelter.
This isn't over, is it?
No, it's not. But we live to fight another day.
As the dropship sped away, leaving the battlefield behind, the reality of their situation set in. The war with the crabs had just begun, and the fate of everyone on Mars was hanging in the balance.